Good evening, comrades. Welcome to the launch of Communist Culture Club. It's a new Zoom series, which is jointly co-sponsored by Marx and the Labour Left Alliance. This is very much a collaborative effort to talk about all things cultural, films, books, podcasts, etc. But we also want to rediscover the history of our own working class culture and thirdly, work towards building a new international culture for the left, where socialists can engage in open debate, where we question everything and everybody. So we're going to jump right in because our first speaker, Ben Lewis, has to shoot off to another meeting. We're going to talk about Women's Day. Tomorrow is International Women's Day, which has become very tame and really been incorporated into establishment culture. You might have seen Rishi Sunak and his lovely billionaire wife trying to tell us, for Grazia magazine, that they have little squabbles about who makes the bed and how they love to make the table, as they said. I mean, clearly neither of them does. The housekeeper does. So we have with us Ben Lewis to remind us about the radical roots of International Women's Day and how we could perhaps reclaim this date in our diary. Within capitalism, which of course oppresses men too, women do still get a double or triple whammy. So in a future session, we also want to look at the culture of matrilineal society, for example. But for now, over to Ben Lewis and the German communist Clara Zetkin, who we both named our daughters after. Hi, Ben.
Hello everyone. Apologies to do this classic thing where you give a talk and then have to run away and not take any questions. So if you do want to contact me with any questions or anything, please just reach out, get in touch either through Tina or directly. I want to title this very brief overview of International Women's Day with Our Day. Our Day was the title of a report written by Clara Zetkin in the pages of her bi-monthly Marxist women's magazine, Die Gleichheit, Equality, on March the 29th, 1911. It was a report of the first demonstrations of International Women's Day, Working Women's Day as it was back then. And I promise that I will have this article translated tomorrow for this occasion, because it's obviously on the one hand a kind of fascinating insight into what actually happened on the day itself. The first International Working Women's Day, as I'll describe it in a second, was celebrated and commemorated in Germany, Austria and Switzerland and Denmark. Those were the four countries for the first year in 1911. But also it's quite prescient insofar as it outlines some of the issues that Tina just alluded to when it comes to the struggle for women's rights and its place within the struggle against capitalism. Here, two pictures. On the one hand, Clara Zetkin, that's her recently produced letters that I'm working on translated into English. The other comrade there is Käthe Duncker, a very important but largely overlooked figure in German communism. And they were the two main motivators of emotion presented to the second International Conference of Socialist Women in Copenhagen in 1910, where it was decided, following on from other developments in the workers' movement, not least the Socialist Party of America's National Women's Day, to dedicate a single day for a demonstration and a celebration for women's suffrage. That was the main goal of the day itself. But obviously that was part and parcel of the outlook and approach of the International Socialist Women's Movement more generally, which, as I've written about on many occasions, was essentially a way of organizing women, workers within the framework of the Socialist Second International and the mass parties of the Second International. So you can see here the motion that was passed, and these women were that passed this motion. This was a meeting of about 100 women in Copenhagen, the second such conference, I think, from 13 countries, including the first elected female MPs who came from Finland. There were 3 of them there at that conference. and they were at pains. There were a number of controversies that kind of went through this conference at the start about the nature of suffrage and what it should be. And the opinion that won the day was that of Zetkin, Dunker, and the radicals in the movement, which said that we shouldn't be content with a kind of so-called partial suffrage, or what Zetkin once called a ladies' suffrage, i.e. a suffrage based on property rights, the existing suffrage that there was for men in Germany, for example, the three-class suffrage based on property and tax duties. Some women in the bourgeois women's movement, for example, would have been quite content with having the vote for themselves, but not for their servants or the people they employed. And there was a controversy about that at this conference, and the radical view won out at the end of the day. What's interesting when it comes to it's got a long and kind of complex history in terms of the Women's Day. I say the first one was 1911. The Russian women celebrated their first International Women's Day, I think, in 1913 or 14. And from that was always the last Sunday of February, the equivalent of which was the 8th of March. And from that time, then that was a kind of standard day in the calendar of the socialist movement. There's obviously a long and complicated history in terms of the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc and how things developed. But it should be remembered that while in the Eastern Bloc it was kind of it was maintained as a day of celebration, at the same time it was also kind of depoliticized. And even to today in post-Soviet Russia, you'll find that women are given flowers on March the 8th, and that's been a practice for a very long time. And again, that's while it's a nice gesture, I suppose, it's not exactly in keeping with the original premise, which was women's political organization and integration into the parties of socialism. And in the Western world, it's following World War II in particular. And in Germany, which was kind of this kind of central battlefield of the Cold War, International Women's Day for a long time was seen as a kind of event of the devil, right? As a kind of communist thing that shouldn't be touched with a barge pole. Indeed, in post-World War II Germany, only a few kind of fringe marginal communist groups actually even bothered to do something on March the 8th and invoke the radical spirit of its founders. Because of, as I said, the general balance of Cold War politics. But there's a shift, and I think it's a shift that's kind of telling in many ways in terms of the fate of the workers' movement, certainly in the West, its integration into state structures, its integration in social democracy into the bourgeois establishment. And really a kind of watershed moment in this is in the 1970s. I think it's 1974 where the United Nations actually officially designates this as a day of celebration of women. And that goes hand in hand, obviously, with a certain agenda, a certain depoliticization, and a certain dehistoricization, of course, that continues apace to this day. Tina mentioned the example of Rishi Sunak. I must admit, when it comes to International Women's Day, I tend to, well, partly because I'm asked to speak usually, so I'm quite busy, but I tend to shy away from the establishment media just because it kind of makes me feel quite ill about, to see how far things have degenerated over the course of the last 100 odd years. And I think that the point I would stress is that, from the very outset, this should be seen as and celebrated and viewed as our day. It is something that, for all the things that have gone wrong, and there are plenty of them, that things that we need to learn from, that we need to be slightly ashamed of, that we need to be to draw lessons from in the history of the socialist movement, it must be emphasized that women's rights, the expansion of women's rights, was to a large extent down to the success of this incredibly important international socialist women's movement that kind of set the pace and set the agenda of these questions at a time when things were even more difficult for women. And I always find it interesting that in the run up to March 8th, you have a few significant days. March 5th was the birth of Rosa Luxemburg. March 6th, by the way, is the day that, certainly in Germany, they've calculated that that's the day in which, given the gender pay gap that exists at the moment, women work basically for free on average until March the 6th. So that's always a nice way of thinking about March the 8th and International Women's Day as well, and the controversies that still surround that. like I say, tomorrow I will have a translation of the report of the first such International Women's Day held by the International Socialist Women's Movement. Here you can just see the call. This was the 6 days before the first demonstration in March 1911. And here, as I say, is the lead article, Unser Tag, our day. There's plenty more to be said about it, but I do have to rush off, so I apologize for that. But I just wanted to give you a quick kind of overview of where it came from, why it came into being, why that history has been lost, and why also, in a sense, even on the far left have kind of we may not have forgotten where International Women's Day comes from. But as I argue in my book on Clara Zetkin, which Tina can promote later on, we've also kind of lost what was unique about the International Socialist Women's Movement, its particular agenda of always tying or marrying the question of the oppression of women to the social question more broadly, and their emphasis over and over again, and you'll see this in the article I'll translate tomorrow, that the emancipation of women must be the work of working class men and women together, and that's always something worth emphasizing. So of the 1 million people that came out for the first demonstration in March 1911 in Germany, it was men and women together, most of whom, not all of whom, were organized in German social democracy. I shall leave it there. As I say, if you have any questions, please send them over, and apologies I have to run off.
Thank you very much, Ben. If you could stop sharing your screen, yep, that'd be good. Thank you for coming along. I could speak with you for hours about that. Just one quick thing before you have to rush off, because it's also important to remember that she was not a feminist, was she, Clara Zetkin?
Yeah, that's right. So that's you will see more about that in the article, and it's also in the book. So that's one of the controversies that again, we've kind of lost our own history, and in a sense we've allowed then this history to be appropriated by establishment feminism, the usual girl boss stuff you see nowadays, and that's a problem. But I think in terms of the left and our own history, we've lost what was unique about Zetkin and her approach to women's liberation, which I go into more detail in the book, and you'll see on my website tomorrow there'll be a translation of it of that first demonstration.
I've put a very long link in the chat. I'm trying to find a shorter link to the Amazon where you can actually buy the book. But it's a good book.
And they're saying where will it be translated? It's marxismtranslated.com. I'll put it up on there tomorrow, and I'm sure we can circulate it or something.
Yes, I'll put it in I'll send out an email tomorrow with all the links. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you, Ben.
Good luck. Take care.
Good luck with your other meeting.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Before we get to our next session, we do want to introduce this session, this series a little bit, which is a bi-weekly series. And you might wonder, there's genocide in Palestine, going towards World War III. There's a record number of people who can't pay their rent, and we talk about culture. Of course, and I know that everything is political, including culture. And, if you look for a definition of it, it really encompasses everything that we add to the natural state of the environment and to ourselves as human beings. And there's a nice quote from Karl Marx, who took culture quite seriously. And I'm just going to share that quickly here, which might inform comrades. So it is an essential side of people's social life activity, which is expressed in all areas of activity, including work, production, technology, science, art, morality, and in their material and intellectual products, as well as in social forms of life as a yardstick for the elaboration of human essential forces. He had a way, didn't he? Making it sound slightly complex, but basically, culture is what we do with the world and in the world and to us and with each other. So this is our first session. We're still playing a little bit with the format. So please get in touch and let us know what's working and what isn't. Also, if you would like to present an item, a presentation about a film or a book, an author, a cultural question or a political question, really, we're open to any ideas and all ideas. info@ymarx.com. Talking about Marx, you might have seen, comrades might have seen that there is an opera called Marx in London, a comic opera about one fictional day in the life of the author of the Communist Manifesto. It had its premiere in Bonn in Germany a couple of years ago, and it's just been produced by the Scottish Opera opera. We sent two comrades to have a look. First, I want to share the trailer to give you an idea about what this is all about. Just a second. It's quite entertaining and it's quite loud. I hope it comes over well in the. There we go. August 1871, the war undone, in death and on the run. Workers of the world, unworthy of the name, leeches on the lake, for street. Lovely. Also had a touch of Monty Python about it. I'm joined by Tam Dean Burn, who's an actor. You've actually worked with Jonathan Doven, who's written the opera. So a comic opera about Marx, does that work?
Yeah, it really did for me. I thought it was great. I mean, opera itself in general is not something I've been particularly active in and going along to it. I didn't know about this form, comic opera, that way. I was in one of the examples of it that's similar to this, The Marriage of Figaro, Mozart, taken from a play, and although set in one day. That's seen as an influence on this show. But this began really, as you said, in Bonn. The director there, the opera, Jürgen Weber, he asked Jonathan Dove if he would be into writing ideally a comic opera about Marx for the 200th anniversary. And Jonathan went for it wholeheartedly. And this was produced in Bonn in 2018, but I mean, it's almost like a caricature, but the Germans didn't really, he says that it took them half an hour to realize it was a comedy. And that, sorry, Tina. But,
no,
yeah, but it was then, as a production, it was going to come to Scotland because they have a tie-in Scottish opera with this opera in Bonn. But COVID struck that, stopped that happening. And then they decided, post-COVID, to make a new production. And I think we've been very lucky with that because as a production, which you got a bit of a sense of that, the scale of it, the set of it, and the video projections and all of that, and the costumes and everything, it works wonderfully. And it does certainly have a sort of feel of Monty Python about it. It is quite farcical in many areas. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. Did you, Matthew?
Yeah, I thought it was great. I think it was not originally also done in London for one show in 2018. It almost as a private thing, I think. And then
I don't know about that.
The thing is, it only actually did 5 nights. So it did 3 nights in Glasgow and 2 in Edinburgh. You know, so the thing is, it was very impressive. You know, the staging and so on, the music was great.
Yeah.
And, you know, Engels appeared in armor and all this sort of stuff. It's very comic and you know, extremely well done and very and packed out as well. I mean, obviously very popular. It was very surprising, you know, given the fact that opera's not very cheap. You know, and obviously not a particularly proletarian audience, but absolutely packed to the gunnels.
What do you think about Marx? I mean, is it more entertaining or is it you know?
I mean, it really, I mean, from the off, there is a spy, you see, first of all, outside their house, Prussian spy, and then a young guy who is trying to find his origins of his family, and he's been told to go to this house. And then the first scene with Marx is he's playing chess with Helena, their sort of housekeeper, and he keeps making advances on her while she's beating him at chess. But all of these elements that come to play in it, and is, you know, they almost immediately then the bailiffs arrive and they get all their furniture taken away. These are all things that actually happened. It does, as Jonathan Dove said, it's looking at Marx and trying to be truthful to what was going on with his and his family's life, but without the ists or the ism. And in a way, it's sort of it's fair enough. It does pay attention to these elements, but it sort of really humanizes them. And the family, there's a bit of a caricature, especially maybe with Jenny, with his wife as the former aristocrat. You know, she doesn't appear politically active or minded really at all, but you do get at least some of the politics. We have a scene at the end of Act 1 where he's gone to the reading room in the British Museum, and he's finding it hard to sit down because he had carbuncles on his backside, and this was a fact as well that he found that difficult. But he's also exhausted because he's been running around trying to sell Jenny's family silver in order to try and get their furniture back. I mean, it was actually even more difficult for them. Their clothes apparently were in and out the pawn shops through their lives. And it's all been taken. Jonathan Dove said Francis Wheen's biography in particular he used, and another one, a guy Sperder, I think it is, an American guy, who his book is called Karl Marx, The 19th Century Life. And again, it's sort of probably, you know, isn't concentrating on the politics. But when he falls asleep in the reading room, he starts dreaming of what he would hope is going to happen. And the chorus arrives, big style, and they are singing soon, soon. And they come on en masse. And then you see that in amongst all these Victorian figures, there's also a civil rights activist, there's a nurse with a low pay sign, there's a suffragette, there's a ACT UP activist, and showing that, you know, that history has produced struggles since then. So it's, you know, not necessarily Marxist, but it certainly pays attention to that. And then in a scene later on in the second half, where they have a sort of unlikely commie karaoke competition in the Red Lion pub, where he's taken on this figure. It's an Italian anarchist, and he is a made-up figure for some reason. But he trounces him in a speech that has a big cash prize at the end of it. And Marx, they do project big style, abolish private property, no more inheritance. And it did produce these sort of quiet chortles directly behind me. Were sitting behind me, and I couldn't tell whether this was sort of Schadenfreude that was at Marx's expense, or whether they were how they were tickled by it. But yeah, I do think it you know, it wasn't a fully fledged Marxist production, but that couldn't have been expected. But it did, you know, it did pay homage to him, and I learned a fair bit from it as well.
Matthew, opera used to be a working class culture. It was part of working class culture going to the opera, and now it is, you know, only
certainly in Italy, yes. Well, it was originally as a form, of course. It was for the masses, but I mean, obviously now, of course, you just can't afford it. So yeah, it's a bit different. Well, you know, the thing is, I mean, obviously people enjoyed it. I mean, there's a number of people. I mean, you know, I usually go most weeks to this. We've got an anti-racist protest in Erskine against a bunch of fascists who keep turning up. But you know, people there had been to see it and they thought it was really funny. So obviously, you know, it was a great production. So obviously, you know, a lot of people thought, you know, were really taken by it, you know, as an event. I mean, it does, as Tam says, you know, take sort of bits and pieces of Marx's actual career. I mean, if I was going to be critical, I would, you say, okay, well, I mean, clearly, you know, Jenny and Carl were very close. I mean, even when Jenny died, you know, she died of cancer. I mean, Engels commented, you know, that really meant that Marx would not survive very long because they were so close, and so it came to pass. And the other person who really, the other person really is then is also Toosey, who comes out as this sort of, you know, flirt. You know, and in fact, you know, Eleanor Marx, and really, you know, as a person, Eleanor Marx is somebody who is owed big debts to in this country, particularly by the unions. None of them acknowledge her, and many of them should.
Weak on the female characters, then you're saying the female characters weren't very developed. Not by a man, who would have thought? But you know, we know that for Marx that was an important question, women's liberation, etc. So thank you both. That's really interesting. It's such a shame it seems to have just finished now, is it?
I mean the nature of it's, but I mean it takes a lot to put on a production, and also, you know, they can't, the performance, just the technique it involves, they can't do it every night. But I would think there's probably a fair chance that it will come to London. Jonathan Dove, he's been involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And he ran the Spitalfields Festival for years, and he's done a lot of stuff in London. And I think there'll be a good chance that it will arrive there. And hopefully, I would imagine he would want, as he's got a sense of community, that he would hope that it was going to be within the price range of people. I'll give it just one, and the Engels. If people go back to the trailer again, it is such a fantastic entrance. He comes in on a penny farthing with these guardian angel wings, and again, he doesn't get much in way of politics, but being a true friend to Marx, certainly. And then it finishes on Hampstead Heath, and it's a wonderful scene there. And that reminded me a lot. I spent many times walking Hampstead Heath with a good communist, Jack Conrad, and it reminded me of that.
Excellent. So, I mean, Tam, if you're in touch with Jonathan, you might, you know, ask him if he knows anything about the opera coming to other places. It would be absolutely fantastic to spread it. Thank you both very much. That was brilliant.
Okay.
If you want to do a review again in the future, get in touch.
Thank you. Well, I'll be back in 2 weeks, apparently. Yeah.
If you're up for it still, on Palestine culture, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.
See you soon. Thank you. We're now having a look at the main item of tonight, which, you know, we're playing a little bit with the format. So we have a few shorter introductions, and we have one key introduction, a longer introduction, which tonight is on Shakespeare, and Shakespeare from a Marxist perspective, which is a really interesting subject, actually, because Marx was very influenced by Shakespeare, and his writings show references to Marx. Just a quick quote, which I've stumbled across when I prepared for this session, from Marx's son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, who was writing about how obsessed Marx was with Shakespeare. He says, His respect for Shakespeare was boundless. He made a detailed study of his works and knew even the least important of his characters. His whole family had a real cult for the great English dramatist. His 3 daughters knew many of his works by heart. When after 1848, he wanted to perfect his knowledge of English, which he could already read, he thought out and classified all Shakespeare's original expressions. His nickname, Moore, was a reference to Othello, etc. So it's a really an interesting link between those two. And I'm really looking forward to this opening now. Over to you, Roger. Oh, you need to unmute, comrade.
Right. Thank you, Tina. Right. First, I can at last reveal the true identity of Shakespeare. The plays of Shakespeare were written by a man called William Shakespeare. It's sheer reactionary snobbery to suggest that his poetry and plays could only have been written by an aristocrat. On the contrary, an aristocrat of that time would have written from a very different perspective. Shakespeare was the son of a prosperous craftsman, an entrepreneur, and mayor of a thriving provincial town. He has too often become, for generations of young people, an instrument of mental torture inflicted by Philistine examination boards via a compliant school brainwashing system. And as for part of my life as an English teacher, I've seen too many schools force their students into utterly pointless dissections of dead texts by linguistic analysis, digging up metaphors and dramatic irony and alliteration and iambic pentameter, treating them as anything other than dramatic entertainment. It's as if you evaluated Michelangelo frescoes in terms of the chemical composition of the paint. Plays are not meant to be read, let alone analysed, but first of all, performed. Now, Shakespeare was an actor and the manager of a theatre company. He deployed his talents to fit the needs of his time, and his very quality of empathy left him impervious to the demands of partisan allegiances. He wrote to entertain the crowds, sometimes pandering to the whims of the royal patrons who sponsored his productions, but always with his finger on the pulse of a society on the brink of massive upheavals. Everyone wants to claim Shakespeare as their own, as an advocate of the divine right of kings, or alternatively, as a champion of democratic human rights, as a secret Catholic subversive, or as a sycophant of the new Protestant ascendancy, as a conservative advocate of royal privilege, or as a forerunner of the coming parliamentarian uprising, as an upstart plebeian entrepreneur, or as a clandestine aristocratic courtier masquerading under a pseudonym. Now, we, for our part, will not cannibalise his memory. How much could the mayor of a provincial English town at the turn of the 17th century have in common with Marxism? Shakespeare was certainly not a pamphleteer. What he was a dramatist with an uncanny ability to penetrate deep into the mind of whatever character crossed his stage. And let's look at some examples. How else could he start with, for instance, the caricatured racial stereotypes of a miserly, vengeful Jewish moneylender, or of a hot-blooded black man manipulated into murdering his wife, and yet, at the same time, enter so utterly and completely into their psyche? Can Shakespeare really speak to us 400 years later as he did to his contemporaries? First of all, I'd say in his comedies, the answer is no, not really. Schools often start children off with comedies like A Midsummer Night's Dream or Twelfth Night or Much Ado About Nothing, in the delusion that these will offer an easy, fun way for them to get started. Unfortunately, the problem is that after 400 years, the old jokes just aren't funny anymore. Humour mutates with each successive generation. The jokes that I found funny in my youth left my elders cold. Tell the same ones to kids nowadays, and they just don't work. Humour tends to titillate the thinly repressed secrets peculiar to each successive generation. And for all the scintillating brilliance of Shakespeare's wordplay, these elaborate operettas of cross-dressing, mistaken identities, excruciating puns, and multiple marriages seem to us very distant, dated period pieces. Tragedy, on the other hand, strikes a chord throughout the ages. The relentless cycle in Shakespeare's tragedies of war, death, betrayal, and bereavement has the same timeless, devastating impact today as it did in his lifetime. Let's focus first on one of Shakespeare's best-known plays, Macbeth. It operates on an extraordinary weave of multiple layers. At its most basic level, it's a simple horror story, complete with witches, ghosts, murderers, black magic, which entertained the crowds just as modern horror movies do. But it was so much more than that. On another level, of course, it was an opportunistic gesture of obsequious deference towards the new king, James I, the king imported from Scotland after the death of the childless Tudor Queen Elizabeth, hence the Scottish play. The storyline can also be seen as a straightforward narration of historical facts. Duncan, Macbeth, and Banquo are real historical figures. The battle referenced in the opening scene against what is called the Norwegians was one of several battles to resist the periodic incursions on Scottish territory by the Vikings. But it was also a deliberate falsification of history. Duncan was in reality just one of a succession of countless rival gangster warlords jockeying for power. He too had become king simply by killing his predecessor, just as he was killed in turn by Macbeth to take his throne. But the flattery and the deliberate deception doesn't stop there. The witches are shown predicting that Banquo shall get kings though thou be none. Now, what's the point of that detail? The fact that King James really was the 8th generation descendant of Banquo. But there's one important little revision that Shakespeare made to the story. Banquo is portrayed in the play as a hero and an innocent victim of Macbeth, while the actual historical truth is that the real Banquo was actually an accomplice together with Macbeth, equally guilty of the murder of King Duncan. But that too is not all. In other ways too, the play shows a sycophantic deference to James. For a start, it indulged his perverse and paranoid obsession with witchcraft. It was James who was soon to initiate a reign of sheer terror and mass hysteria in which thousands of women were tortured, mutilated, burned alive, or drowned. These old village women were the living link to centuries of rural wisdom and folk medicine. The orgy of witch hunting was not just an outbreak of mass hysteria, it was designed to wipe out all traces of pagan pre-Christian traditions and to entrench through a reign of terror the absolute domination of the Protestant Church. Note, for instance, that among the foul ingredients itemized in the witch's cauldron, as listed in their famous incantation, bubble, bubble, toil, and trouble, are included the following: liver of blaspheming Jew, and nose of Turk and Tartar's lips. Of course, Turks were the archetypal Muslims, and the Tartars were another name for Genghis Khan's Muslim Mongol invaders who had occupied most of Europe. So they were symbols of rival religious cultures which had to be cursed, exorcised, and stamped out mercilessly. But on yet another level too, Shakespeare's plot was consciously crafted to suit the immediate political agenda of the ruling class. This was the crucial period of revolutionary conflict and transition and metamorphosis. British society was convulsed by the death agony of feudalism and the painful birth pangs of capitalism. The rise of the merchant class, the class into which Shakespeare was born, and, let's repeat, very definitely not that of the Earl of Essex or any of the other aristocrats that some people have tried to shoehorn into Shakespeare's place. In ideological terms, this conflict was projected onto the religious plane, and perhaps the one single most dramatic event in this social transition, an alarming tremor anticipating the social earthquake to come, had taken place just months before the production of this play. Now that immediate shock, one which shook the establishment to its core and haunted it literally for centuries to come, an event which is still memorialized every year over 400 years later on Bonfire Night, was Guy Fawkes's Gunpowder Plot, which the previous year had literally almost blasted the entire state machine sky high. It was an audacious act of terror that had an impact comparable to that of 9/11 in modern times. If Catesby, Fawkes and their Catholic conspirators had succeeded in blowing up Parliament on 5th of November 1605, the day of its official royal opening, the entire state, King, Lords, Parliament and bureaucrats, would have been vaporized. So what does this have to do with Macbeth? The answer is absolutely everything. The reference is hammered home in almost every line of the play. How? By using a device, the significance of which may mean little to a modern audience, but whose impact to a contemporary audience would have been crystal clear. The constant theme throughout the play, the motif running through almost every other line, that of equivocation. It's a constant motif, saying one thing, meaning the opposite. Double talk. The opening words of the play are, "Fair is foul and foul is fair." The opening lines spoken by Macbeth when he first appears on stage are, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." Every one of the witch's predictions has contradictory levels of meaning, a conclusion that Macbeth reaches only too late, tormenting himself with the awful realization that their tricks and deceptions and double talk have destroyed him. He says, "I begin to doubt the equivocation of the fiend that lies like truth." And later, "Be these juggling fiends no more believed, that palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope." There are constant variations on this theme on almost every page of the play, even the ghoulish scene of comic relief, when the drunken porter stumbles onto the initial murder scene, jokes that drink is, as he puts it, an equivocator, because it heightens sexual desire, but dampens sexual performance. So, why this constant motif of equivocation? What on earth has this got to do with the contemporary context? What's the connection? It may seem obscure, but it will soon become relevant. It's this. The conspiracy behind the Gunpowder Plot was planned by a secret society of Catholics, the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits. Members of this cabal were at the time of Macbeth's first performance now on the run from state terror, and each of them carried with them a booklet of coded instructions from the Jesuits, a secret treatise on how to evade police interrogation. It advised its members that under police questioning, rather than commit the sin of outright perjury, they should resort to ambiguity, evasion, and double entendre, in other words, equivocation. They were neither to confess nor to lie, but to prevaricate. And what was its title? The title of this booklet? On Equivocation. So the reference to equivocation and its constant deployment in the play would have been immediately appreciated in the feverish mood of the time, when Catesby and Fawkes were seen as genuinely frightening, sinister bogeymen comparable to Osama bin Laden or ISIS in more recent times. So Macbeth thrilled its audience as much as any modern horror movie, but it also shamelessly flattered the new Scottish King James, who was soon to instigate a very real countrywide witch-hunting hysteria. And that's why he cast in the role of a paragon of virtue Macbeth's actual historical accomplice in regicide. He colluded in stoking up a mass frenzy of revenge against the terrorist monster of his day, and he exposed their advocacy of the practice of equivocation as a tactic to be used to evade self-incrimination. Now, I've concentrated on Macbeth. Similar commentaries could be composed for many of Shakespeare's best plays: Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, The Merchant of Venice. School teachers, of course, drone on pedantically about these plays as if they were mere regurgitations from the rules of the ancient Greeks. Almost all of them subscribe to the hackneyed doctrine that they all fit the templates of great heroes brought to ruin with inexorable inevitability by their own fatal flaws. And actually, this completely misses the mark. The agonizing dilemmas faced by Lear, Brutus, Hamlet, Henry V, Romeo, and many more all arise from the irreconcilable clash between the growing aspirations of the individual on the one hand and the rigid demands of a hidebound state against which he is rebelling, a tension which is already bursting society at its seams. This is a recurring theme in Shakespeare's plays. For instance, in Romeo and Juliet, in which Verona's rival, lawless, warring mafia street gangs defy the flagging authority of the prince's laws, and the young lovers rebel against the authority of their parents. In Hamlet, which portrays the adolescent rebellion of a prince against his stepfather, the illegitimate murderous king. In Julius Caesar, a study of conspiracy, assassination, and civil war. Shakespeare depicted, and that's the answer to the person who said, what's this to do with Marxism? Shakespeare depicted the growing antagonisms threatening to tear apart a hidebound, moribund, rotting feudal structure. Remember that England was soon to become the first country since classical times to chop off the head of a king. Now, it's true that wherever they appear in these plays, the common masses are depicted as raucous, fickle, and malleable. In Julius Caesar, they're swayed within minutes from one allegiance to another, first by the plain-spoken oratory of Brutus, and then by the manipulative rhetoric of Mark Antony. Shakespeare was no democrat. And yet in all his best plays, you can hear, and there again is the answer, the approaching rumble of civil war, the stripping for all time of dynastic authority. I'll give a couple of examples, then I'll finish. What does the young King Henry V say while in disguise? He says, I think the king is but a man as I am. In his nakedness he appears but a man. In King Lear, Shakespeare literally strips a king naked and sends him raving and delirious into a storm-drenched wilderness, accompanied only by a clown and a blind madman. And in this play, above all, he presents an unmistakable image where royalty is literally stripped of all its trappings to reveal a poor, vulnerable, pathetic old weakling. Again, listen to these words of Lear. They told me I was everything. 'Tis a lie. I'm a very foolish, fond old man. And then again, here I stand, your slave, a poor, infirm, weak, and despised old man. And he even says, thou hast seen a farmer's dog bark at a beggar, and the creature run from the cur. There thou mightst behold the great image of authority, a dog's obeyed in office. In other words, even a dog, if you give it the title, then ordinary, non-aristocratic mortals will fear and cringe before it. So these plays could not have been written either a century earlier or a century later. They could only have grown out of the soil of a society just one generation away from civil war. And they encompass all the poetry, passion, and intensity of a society on the brink of revolution. Right. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Roger. There's been a bit of a hoo-ha in the in the chat. Comrades are taking exception to you dismissing his comedies. But a couple of comrades, Luke, Luke, I'm going to bring him in quickly. So we'll probably discuss this now rather than wait till later. I think that might work better. And Ian, I think, as well. Make some points on this. So Luke, if you could start your camera and your video, sorry, your microphone, and I can bring you in straight away.
Okay.
Hold on at you. Hi, Luke. Go on.
Hello, good evening.
Hi.
I didn't expect this. I'm a little bit unprepared, but I'll do my best. Thank you, Roger, for the presentation. Very stimulating, and it's great to see others take such an interest in Shakespeare's work and its relevance for us today. I must say, though, I was a bit disappointed by the rather casual dismissal of the wonderful comedies and their profound relevance to issues of gender above all today, and patriarchy. If you take, for example, the cross-dressing you mentioned, Roger, I don't see it as something quaint at all. I see it as an incredibly innovative device, way ahead of its time, for exploring the boundaries of gender. And we see this very clearly in Twelfth Night with Viola and Olivia, and the incredible confusion that arises in gender relations because of the cross-dressing. Of course, the cross-dressing is on one level, it's a merely practical device, because we had boy act in Shakespeare's theatre, women were not allowed to take part. And Shakespeare got round this, if you like, by the device of cross-dressing. But at the same time, cross-dressing gives him the opportunity to explore what it means to be a stereotypical woman, and the freedom, the empowerment which a woman acquires when she's dressed as a man and acquires another voice. You see this particularly with Rosalind. Rosalind in As You Like It is a massive role for females. And every great actress of our time has always wanted to play Rosalind, as they've wanted to play Cleopatra, as they've wanted to play Viola, and all the female characters, almost with an Othello. I mean, there are so many ways in which Shakespeare gives females a voice at the same time as having to struggle against the typical patriarchal view of women who should know their place. I mean, Taming of the Shrew is a fascinating example of this contradiction. On the one hand, it's a comedy. You dismissed the comedies. I think Taming of the Shrew is a wonderful starting point for discussion. It's despised by some, and some people say it shouldn't be put on at all nowadays because of the taming by Petruchio of Caterina. But at the same time, Shakespeare is full of contradictions, and this is very Marxian. And I think Marx would have appreciated the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis that you get in Shakespeare's comedies. He takes a proposition, the typical, if you like, traditional feudal view of a woman's place, and he constantly questions this. He does it in A Midsummer Night's Dream. You mentioned The Midsummer Night's Dream. This is one of the most powerful ways in which Shakespeare shows he can explore the limits of eroticism, and he can give women a voice in this battle of the sexes, and all within a framework of patriarchal authority, which time after time Shakespeare's women challenge. This is profoundly Marxist for me. And to dismiss the comedies and their exploration of the antiquated, if you like, framework of patriarchy, I think it's a shame, because there are so many treasures there. There are so many things that we can learn from in discussing. I'm not saying there's a one-dimensional, positive presentation of women by any means in Shakespeare. There are tensions, there are contradictions, and I think Marx is all about contradictions and resolving them through struggle. And the device of cross-dressing does allow Shakespeare to give women a powerful voice. And you can see that he is preoccupied with this issue when you look at the sonnets. You take a sonnet like My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun. You take a sonnet like, the Master Mistress sonnet. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted, hast thou the master mistress of my passion. There he's in the sonnet doing what he does in the comedies, which is to explore the if you like, the blurred distinction between gender. He doesn't present gender as black and white and absolute. And I think that's incredibly 21st century and postmodern, if you like. So if we look at the sonnets, And what he does there with the young, fair youth, and we look at the comedies at the same time, we can see a line of connection. And it's about exploring the end of an old feudal order and the rise of a new middle class where roles in society are being redefined, constrained largely through developments in the economy and shifting social classes. And again, can I just mention, well, I've said enough for the time being. I'd also like to come back to the rather unquestioning dismissal of the authorship question, which I would have expected a Marxist to have a more critical approach toward. It's a very misguided view from what I'm a skeptic, and I'm not an aristocrat. I'm a left-winger, and I think, on the contrary, the traditional view of the authorship is a reactionary view, which reinforces the establishment perception of Shakespeare, who does not challenge the current structures of power. Whereas those who question the traditional story, you often find, are exploring far deeper into class distinctions in Shakespeare through the conflict between the aristocracy, the middle classes, and ordinary working people. I think I've said enough, but thank you, Roger, for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Luke. I mean, we want this series to be, where we question each other very much. So you're very welcome also to prepare another session if you fancy, where you present a different point of view. We put you a little bit on the spot there. So if you want another, yeah, fantastic. I'll get in touch with you. I've got your email now. Thank you. Ian, you wanted to say something.
Firstly, thank you, Roger Silverman. I wish you taught me Shakespeare. It was brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had the great good fortune, despite going to a crappy London comprehensive, it had a really good drama department. And we regularly used to go out to watch Shakespeare plays at the open air theatre in London. This was before the Globe had been built. And one of my drama teachers, who happened to be a communist, said, Shakespeare is ours. He wrote for ordinary working people. He didn't write for people who spoke like this and make grand gestures and strange kind of intonation. They were just all. And when subsequently the Globe Theatre was built, with the help of a communist, by the way, Sam Wanamaker was kicked out of the USA because because of the McCarthyite witch hunt. Came to Britain and was able to get a living, like so many actors who were driven out of the United States. His great love of Shakespeare and his in a sense his gratitude for Britain providing him with a home was a guiding force behind the development of the Globe Theatre. And I still recommend to anybody to go and watch Shakespeare at the Globe, because you get a feel for what it might have been like. I've sat there stood there, because I like going in the groundlings, where you just pay a nominal fee to, and you stand through the performance, but you can boo and you can hiss and you can, and that kind of stuff. So the other thing was, I too also happen to love the comedies. I find, though, that the problem is that the directors often murder the comedy, and of course it's down to the skill of the director as much as anything else. But there's also quite a lot of comedy even in the tragedies, because of course Shakespeare used comedy for relief along the way. The famous one, and it's one sadly which is often cut out by contemporary directors, because it's almost as if they're frightened to put the comedy in, as if we're too stupid to understand it or something like this.
Can I say something about this?
Yeah, in a minute. Let me finish.
Yeah, okay, of course.
Yeah, shut your face. And in the gravedigger scene, for example, in Hamlet, there's a little line which I quite like. He said, Hamlet asked the gravedigger, "How long may a man lie in his grave ere he rot?" And the gravedigger replies, "Oh, in faith, if he be not rotten before he die, as we have a good many pocky courses now a days that will scarce hold the lying in." And then he goes on to say, he will last some 8 years or 9 years. This was a direct reference to syphilis, which was quite widespread in Shakespeare's time, and the audience would have fell about, because you know the idea of you catch the pox and your nose rots off and all this kind of stuff was a generalized feature. Now there's an advantage to doing some sort of textual analysis, because otherwise you miss some of the bright spots, and there's a lot of really funny lines throughout Shakespeare in both the comedies and the tragedies, but it's just one of the things I really hated when I was involved in Marxist politics in a certain northern city which remain nameless, is that quite often you get something that was supposed to be kind of political, and it would be kind of you'd be lectured to from the stage, as it were, by people who, this is written by an ordinary working man, you know, and this kind of stuff, ignoring the fact that the classics are just full of stuff which is of direct relevance to us and was written for us, and it's utterly beautiful, and thank you, Roger. It was an excellent presentation.
Tam wanted to say something as well.
Hi. Shut the door, please, Mark. I can't get to unmute. There we are. Yeah, just draw people's attention to the what I posted in the chat. There's an absolutely fantastic talk, especially on the comedies, by a guy called Jacob Fischel, who's in New York, but a wonderful Shakespeare expert, that he gave to the radical anthropology group called The Anthropology of Shakespeare. And I've learned so much from that, because like Ian, I've found that most of the comedies that I have seen just didn't hit the mark, and were sort of, it made it understandable what Roger was saying. But I just wanted to draw attention as well to what I've discovered about Shakespeare and his influence in Gaza. There's a wonderful Gaza monologue called From Gaza to Shakespeare. It starts off, "Help me, my friend, how can you be present? After more than 500 years, you jump before my eyes with every image and every cry. I hear you screaming with the children and sharing their crying with the mothers, dressed in black like Hamlet's father, emerging from under the rubble carrying a child's toy." If you go to the Gaza monologue site, you'll find all that. And Rifat Alaria, who was assassinated in December, on YouTube, there's a whole range of his lectures on Shakespeare to his students in Gaza, who he encouraged them to learn English and to study Shakespeare. And there's a wonderful book called Enter Ghost, Isabella Hamad, about a production of Hamlet going on in the West Bank. And I was hoping that we were going to have, there was going to be a Shakespeare celebration on his birthday, April the 23rd, where all this would be raised in where it all started, before the Globe, where Ian was talking about, in Shoreditch. I was a member of the Shakespeare in Shoreditch Society, and on the 400th anniversary to the day when it moved from the theatre to the Globe, we did a production written by an amazing actor who played Mercutio in Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, John McHenry. That he wrote a play about a production of Tamburlaine being rehearsed, and the bailiff's at the door, so they have to give up. And I was in this production. We did it. It was between Christmas and New Year, late 90s, and we then marched from Shoreditch to the Globe with two wooden beams represented what they took from there, and we marched through the city. Between Christmas and New Year, the whole place is dead, but we had two oxen taking these down through the city, and Mark Rylance was waiting for us at the Globe.
Wow.
to celebrate that. That was an extraordinary event. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. But this is great. Yes, great chat.
Thank you, Tam. Roger, do you want to reply to? Oh, I think Luke wanted to say something briefly. In addition.
Well, there's so much we could say, and I don't want to monopolize. The previous speaker just mentioned Mark Rylance. Mark Rylance is not an aristocrat. He's not reactionary. He's one of our great Shakespearean actors and has devoted his life to Shakespeare. And he's a Shakespeare skeptic concerning the authorship. I think we should bear that in mind. And many other great actors of today, including Derek Jacobi. I don't think they're snobs. And I actually think from a Marxist perspective, there is much more mileage to be got from recognizing the true nature of Elizabethan theatre as having its roots in the aristocracy, in the sense that Shakespeare's plays were not first performed in the Globe. They were first performed for the Queen. They were performed in the palace. He's a court poet, and a courtly poet above all, and a courtly playwright. Once we understand that, and there's a book by Richard Dutton, a great mainstream Shakespearean scholar, called Shakespeare Court Playwright. I recommend we have a look at it, because he explodes the myth that Shakespeare wrote primarily for the masses. He has nothing but contempt for the masses. And we must recognize this. This is not what Marx liked about Shakespeare. He does time and again show he has no respect, and he thinks they're good for a laugh. They smell, their breath smells. He brings them in when he explores the riots which followed from the dearth, from the famine in those times in Coriolanus. And this is what we should be looking at, what he does with them in Julius Caesar, in Coriolanus. This is an aristocratic perspective. He's an aristocrat through and through in his ideology. I don't know who wrote the plays, but the ideology of the plays, if we're talking from a Marxist perspective, is the ideology of a feudal cast of mind which sees the feudal order crumbling and sees the rising middle class taking the place of the corrupt and bankrupt aristocracy. So the comedies, it's misleading to think that comedy in Shakespeare means laughter. It doesn't. It means at the end of a comedy, people get married. At the end of a tragedy, they die. This is the essential, quintessential distinction, not that it is funny. Because as a previous speaker mentioned, Shakespeare mixes comedy and tragedy in all of his plays. The tragedies are full of comedy. And the point is about the comedies that they end in harmony, sometimes a very forced harmony. It's particularly in The Taming of the Shrew, for example, and in the problem plays. The harmony which is forced upon them begs a lot of questions. And this is what I find is radical about Shakespeare, the gaps in Shakespeare, the contradictions in Shakespeare. And we should mention Timon of Athens, which was Marx's favorite Shakespeare play, and the exploration of the power of gold. And it's all done through the perspective of the ruling class, Roger. It is not done through the perspective of working people. There's nothing snobbish about saying these plays are redolent of respect for the monarchy, respect for the hierarchical order of society, at the same time as exploring and questioning that hierarchy. This is exactly what Hamlet is. Hamlet is a feudal prince, and it's the voice of the feudal prince which is questioning the rotten state of the establishment of Denmark in that particular play. So I think historical facts should be of great interest to Marxists, and we should not repeat the myths of the traditional establishment view about Shakespeare from Stratford, about whom we know virtually nothing. And we have this ridiculous theory of a genius who made it all up and wrote 37 plays about court life, and not a single play about working people, and not a single play apart from the Merry Wives of Windsor about the middle classes, vaguely. So this is odd. This is odd in a working chap from Stratford, and I grew up near Stratford, and I made the pilgrimage to Stratford many, many times in my life. And I taught the myth of Shakespeare, the uncritical view of Shakespeare. It's time we really brought Shakespeare into the 21st century and recognized him as somebody who is deeply embedded in the politics of his time. And if you ignore the court politics, you ignore the political aspect of Shakespeare. The whole perspective of the plays is of somebody who's familiar with the struggle for power in the court, and in the comedies, the conflict between patriarchy and the female characters. But if we begin from the point of view that he wrote for the masses, for which there is no evidence, as I say, I will end with the comment at the beginning. He has nothing but contempt for the masses. This does not make him of no interest to a Marxist like myself, a fairly amateur Marxist, may I say, but I find his relevance is profound, as it was to Marx himself, not because he wrote for the people or from the perspective of the people, but because he showed the cracks and the contradictions in the established order of the Tudor dynasty and then the Jacobean dynasty after that. Thank you once again, Roger. I think I should shut up now.
Interesting point of view. I'm glad we're having this discussion. Roger, now
Yes.
you can.
Well, look, there's a lot of things. Luke, thank you for very stimulating and provocative points that you're making. But with all due respect, you either you weren't listening properly to what I said, or I didn't put it over properly. But I never said, in fact, I explicitly denied that Shakespeare was a friend of the masses. I said I can find the text of what I said in a minute. I referred, for instance, to Julius Caesar and the Brutus and Mark Antony speaking to the crowd, and I said, on the contrary, he shows no respect and no faith in the masses at all. He portrays them as being completely gullible, swayed, really just putty in the hands of the orators, first of Brutus and then of Mark Antony. I didn't say that he was any friend of the working classes. I said that he was, but I did say that he was showing the collapse and the breakdown of the old feudal monarchic structure and anticipating the revolution and the civil war that was coming. And I think that is the only way that can be explained. And when you say, the traditional view, I was not putting a traditional view at all. The traditional view, the one that is always taught by the mainstream, is always that Shakespeare is somehow sort of timeless. And as I think I quoted again at the beginning, the idea of Greek tragedy, that all he's doing is showing heroes, great people with one single fatal flaw which undermines them. And I was saying it's nothing to do with that. It's absolutely not. What it is about is again and again, and I gave a fair number of quotes which I think backs up the idea that he was talking about the complete collapse of the old monarchical structure and hierarchy, and anticipating the revolution that was coming and the civil war, which doesn't mean that he had faith in the working class, but it does mean that he was anticipating and again, that's why the question of authorship comes in, because the traditional idea all that I've heard of what people who say, oh, it wasn't Shakespeare couldn't have done that, he was he couldn't have had the education, he was from a middle class background, only an aristocrat would have known, would have been familiar with Latin and all the history and so on. I mean, the fact is that that idea comes from prejudices of people who do not understand the significance of Shakespeare's play in terms of his finger on the pulse of the coming bourgeois revolution, the coming civil war, and the breakup of feudal society. As for the comedies, by the way, I mean, I didn't say they weren't any good. I said they don't work so well for a modern audience, and they don't. And the reason, all I was saying, I made my comment that humor does humor is very ephemeral. It changes very much from generation to generation. And what seemed funny 400 years ago doesn't really work. And I'm saying that as the experience of teaching in schools, where so many schools start by saying, "Oh well, let's give them a nice easy introduction by letting them watch what Much Ado About Nothing or something," and it's completely confusing. It's just so difficult for them to follow, and the humor they just don't find it funny. And maybe there's something wrong with me, but for me, I just don't think it works. And I think for most people, it's the same thing. The tragedy, on the other hand, immediately they strike, and I agree. Of course, there's comedy in the tragedies, and I suppose to some extent vice versa. But I mean, I quoted the comic scene in Macbeth where the porter knockabout farce almost of the drunken porter coming in just at that fatal moment, just after the murder of Duncan. There is humour, of course, in the tragedies and so on, but the comedies themselves are very, very stylized, and they belong to an era so removed that they actually are. I don't think that they have much impact nowadays. Maybe other people see it a different way. Maybe, I mean, I would very much like to hear a lead off by Luke, on putting his point of view, although we got quite a lot of it tonight too. And maybe I can come in perhaps, and we can have a bit of a debate.
Sounds very interesting. Thank you very much, Roger, and thank you, Luke, Tam, Ian, all contributed to this discussion. We can continue it a little bit later if you have things that you still want to say, but we want to get to our next item before people get tired. And this is The Way, a three-part drama series on the BBC. The Daily Mail and the Telegraph are gloating that it's got the smallest audience ever for a BBC primetime drama. That's because it's about the left, it's rubbish. But just under 1 million people watched it live on BBC. I reckon though quite a few people will have watched it like myself. I binge it on iPlayer. That's how people usually watch TV these days. I really enjoyed it, especially the first episode. It has many references to previous working class struggles, not just the miners' strike. The Hollywood actor Michael Sheen has undergone quite the political transformation. Comrades might have known about this. He moved back to Wales. He's sold all of his possessions, well, most of them anyway, and he's getting quite involved in local campaigns. Bit of a Welsh nationalist too, which is understandable, and that finds reflection in this drama. There's also an interesting quote in there from the father, who's a bit of a collaborator, who says, "The British don't revolt, they grumble." Or do they? And that's quite an interesting theme that goes through this The Way, because there's actually quite a lot of history of the British doing more than grumbling. Paul Jones has watched the 3 episodes for us, but I will first show the trailer a bit for comrades who haven't seen it yet. That gives a bit of a flavor of what this is about. Here it is.
Once upon a time, in a kingdom far, far away.
I just sick of feeling like we have no power.
People will get hurt. They always get hurt.
How bad does it have to get before we, leave?
Leave where? After all that?
The Driscolls, highest grade target.
Oh, Dad, come on! We're fugitives, fleeing from a hold on foot, no possessions. I won't let my family risk this. It's your alternative. Is this a dream?
You mean a nightmare?
Paul Jones then, he's got problems with his camera, so we're just going to hear from him. You've rewatched it again. Is it required watching for Marxists?
Yes, I think it is, and I think the Daily Mail hate this story because it tells the tale of this Port Talbot uprising in the near future in a kind of imaginative and accessible way, and that reflects contemporary fracture point. It's a story about people coming together because they have to, even despite issues within families and within communities, and there's references throughout to us having to learn to talk to each other, and that's reflected in the family and within some of the meetings that discuss the strike action and how they're going to take on the what they fear is the closing down of the steelworks in Port Talbot. I think it's also interesting that we've got a program on television that uses the language of the labour movement, of socialism, something that wouldn't have been so out of place in the 1970s. Things like Labour Today, and this is something that's quite rare now. So I imagine it did give a few people a few sleepless nights. And as you said, like the director, Michael Sheen, I think is a native of Port Talbot. Probably you could describe him as a kind of Welsh Republican socialist. Is set in the near future, as I said, and it's has aspects of kind of magical realism interwoven with strong themes of that were very recognizable: social and industrial decline. I think actually the Daily Mail posed 697,000 views directly, as opposed to 2.3 million for Celebrity Big Brother. But as you said, iPlayer is one issue. But I do think we need to accept that we live in a depoliticized moment, and that's kind of reflected in the way there's lots of reference points to lots of references to we just want everything to get back to as they were, and and like a nostalgia for a time when people cared about us, which I thought was interesting. I mean, the story starts with one of the workers in the steelworks being falling into the furnace and being burnt alive. And it's ironic, given the recent self-immolation of Aaron Bushnell, that it starts with the worker's father going into the high street and setting himself on fire, and this sort of sets in motion, the story as it unravels. With one of the chief characters, Jeff Driscoll, and it follows the Driscoll family. He's a trade union steward, and he's the father of he's the son of a miner and someone involved in the miners' strike who kills himself after the defeat of the miners' strike. And I think this is a very strong theme throughout. You've got like Jeff is very clearly a defeated and a depressed and an alienated individual, both within his family and in terms of politically. There's a one part where his estranged wife Dee says in the meeting that discusses strike action, you practically used to be an anarchist, and look at you now. He's described within as a conciliator by the more radical chief steward. Owen, the chief character, who's his son, notes you don't do anything, and it kind of highlights his kind of decaying role as a union activist and as a father. You're seeing, and I think this is probably themes that are very recognizable to people who've come out of deindustrialization and who've lived across the last 4 decades. Another very interesting theme is like different aspects of mythology that are interwoven, and there's lots of like stuff that reflects Sheen's kind of Welsh nationalism. There's like this, he grabs hold of this sword, and which is chucked into the sea at the end, and it's kind of evokes kind of pan-Celtic Arthurian legend. equally, there's lots of other sort of subtle reference points throughout. There's I don't know if you've noticed the Red Star Chinese takeaway, and there's an argument at a kid's birthday party where Dee faces off with one of her neighbours who pays homage to Thatcher, enabling her to buy her council house while she's talking about we need to do something because our children have got no future. So these kind of arguments that take place in working class communities is kind of given an airing throughout. Episode 1 sees the steelworks furnace flame going out, given sort of safety work completed by management. And again, there's local legends prophesizing doom for the locality should this happen. And this is something that is explored throughout. And in the meeting, we have interesting set of reference. I think you mentioned it, Tina, to the historical struggles of the Chartists, the Newport Rising, the General Strike, the 85 miners' strike, and so on. And for a lot of us, watching, this will be, stuff that we all know about. Incidentally, there's an image in one of these images is the plaque in Newport of the Newport Rise. That's the one, actually, which I think was criminally destroyed by local authority. It's a historic emblem. I think this happened about a few years ago. But anyway, we see, a successful strike ballot, and a kickoff takes place with an intersection of blockade, strike action, and self-organisation featuring. The whole series is quite interesting and how it's put together. The first episode in particular is very quickly paced, quite surreal in many respects. It's cut in with lots of CCTV imagery, lots of references to social media, even emojis sort of flying about, and it kind of provides link between, intergenerationally between like traditional forms of struggle supplemented by new technology, which for us potentially allows movements to emerge quickly. However, we see in that the heavy response of the state, and in part of that they turn off the internet. And in episode 3, this is identified as leading to a generalized glitch. And throughout, you've got TV images that sort of play on this like nostalgic feel. There's lots of clips that emerge from Carry On films, Dad's Army, Benny Hill, and so on, which is quite amusing. But the discussion flowing on from that notes how we create the online space by what we upload, and we're just rehashing like the present from the past. And our desire for a more secure existence. I want things back the way they were is said, and that's counterposed in discussion by us needing to imagine a different future, which I thought was interesting. The themes of class are obviously, I mean, there's lots of themes to around Wales and so on, but the themes of class are unquestionable, and they both reflect Michael Sheen's politics and our own fractured moment. The issues explored, could just as easily refer to other ex-industrial areas in Britain or internationally. And I guess like Welsh nationalism, the feature of this, we see this in Scotland, and I've seen other comments, people talking about, oh, my grandparents were miners in Scotland, and they feature on the locality rather than class. I think that's interesting, and we just have to grapple with. Anyway, we see the riot, the strike, the march, and so on, and we see Dee, which is Jeff's estranged wife, giving passion speeches on the picket line, and Owen, the son, who's there. We can see his head in the middle, throws a bar in a kind of act of defiance. And he's someone he says, yeah, I like being numb. He's a drug addict. He talks about, I like being numb. He's on medication and so on. He kind of comes to life in this moment. Further themes of lockdown, internment camps, militarized and technological responses from the state are introduced. And it's all, you know, very, very interesting.
Can I ask you a
Events.
couple of questions, Paul? Because you mentioned there's lots of references when I took notes and I almost couldn't stop taking notes because you have the football stadium, they're being rounded up and put into a football stadium where they, you know, deterred. It's like Chile, isn't it, when they illegally arrested all these workers and socialists. You have, and I found almost the most moving one is Anna is the girlfriend of the main character. And, you know, the family now has to flee. All the lots of Welsh people are trying to flee into England. And they're like, I can't believe we're refugees, but we're just normal people. And she says, you know, this is going on everywhere in the world. You know, there's so many refugees and now you're one of them. I thought that was very moving, you know, that how quickly things can turn around for normal people who suddenly become refugees.
Yes, of course. It's quite interesting. Anna's in the pub at one point, and she's the only one who could go to the bar because she's Polish. You know, you know, and they as Welsh people can't have to keep their mouth shut. And there's one point where the son Reese talks about they're in a corner shop and he says diolch, which is I think thank you in Welsh, which gives the game away. I mean, some of it, you know, there are some laboured points. You know, it's you know, and we could all be critical of you know we're spoon fed some of the themes, but it's very interesting and it weaves in lots and lots and lots of information, issues, and kind of, you know, you've got Freemasons, you've got Dee's anglicised sister who lives with a very posh upper middle class family of you know, and they escape to the south coast, and there's the makeshift refugee camp Newport Talbot, and the introduction of a character, the Welsh catcher, which I struggled with that bit a bit. It was a bit in between Doctor Who and the Mighty Boosh, you know. But you've got this character, an ex-Iraq War mercenary, pragmatically just following orders.
He was actually Welsh, as it turns out, isn't he?
He's Welsh, of course, you know, which is interesting in of itself. But there's also reference points to the state being worried about copycat uprising. And then, of course, there's this thing about the Red Monk. And it's all kind of mythology in creation. And I think we should think about this. You know, I mean, in the past, the Labour movement, you know, had adjuncts of drama groups and all the rest of it who created stories that reflected working class subjectivity and so on. But of course, then you've got, and I'll finish soon. It's just I don't want to. I'm sure most people have seen the play, but we can explore some of these themes. But while crossing the channel, you know, it's very evokes the experience, as you said, of refugees coming into England, and we've got these people trying to get out. The boat begins to sink and take on water, and Jeff, it has this kind of moment of transcendence in a sense. He's made peace with his kind of dead father, and this antagonism, political and personal antagonism between them, which is I think really interesting, is kind of resolved, as it is with the rest of his family. And you know, at the beginning, he's a conciliator. He describes a scab at one point. He said, "I've never felt so connected," and he's talking about his family. But I mean, this goes beyond that. His kind of consciousness is being raised in that moment.
You notice, by the way, that they don't say scabs; they say outside labour, which I thought was interesting.
No. There's a bit where he gets to Newport Talbot where the chief steward finds that he's given notes to management and stuff, and he calls him a scab, I think, at one point.
At that point, okay. But when the actual strike breakers,
there's other issues of the strike breakers being brought in, and Thea, the daughter, who's also in the police, having to face off against her family, and that's an interesting, dilemma for her. And the only way she can resolve that is through, doing a Thelma and Louise thing, getting hold of the police van and taking them off to the south coast.
Yeah, so it was interesting that they used private policing, didn't they, or a private company to police
or something, I think they were called, and they're interesting. They're all very hyped up as well, and there's obviously lots of reference points to the miners' strike throughout. I think some of the identification of the role of women again is quite interesting, and again probably speaks to the experience of the women's support movement during the miners' strike.
But what was interesting about the policing, I think during the miners' strike, they made a point of not using local police, didn't they? Because these communities, they knew each other, and you actually saw that happening. They didn't do that in this one, where the daughter has to arrest her brother, etc., and they try to avoid all of that because often the police then would go over to the strikers.
Yes, and I think in those communities, there would have been lots of that. Wouldn't have been uncommon. People who had people join the police as well as having minors and so on in the family. So I think sometimes. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, can I ask you one thing? And one theme you mentioned this is the looking back. I thought that was slightly labored. We want to just things go back to normal, and at the end he's got the young man who he's trying to go back to fight, but you do wonder what is he fighting for, or what is his kind of vision, and that perhaps reflects somebody like Michael Sheen, who's very angry with the state of the world, but I don't think he's a socialist. He's clearly got no idea where to go or what to do. So it's all like a reaction against something without an idea of where to go beyond. We need to fight back. Yeah, but what are you fighting for?
I think he's obviously been privy to working class history, to aspects of the socialist tradition, which a younger generation probably are less familiar with, and it's kind of it's interesting. You've got this like the guy, the Jeff's father, who's been in the miners' strike, militant and all the rest of it, but very much part of the upswing of organised labour in the 1970s, and the defeat of that generation. Jeff's probably my age, mid-50s and so on, and the generation oncoming are kind of having to relearn some of these themes and practices, because they have to, which I think is interesting. I mean, stylistically, as I said, there are definitely limitations in this. Much of it's forced, but the logic of it, I think, is that we need to act and be successful and struggle, and it's that intergenerational thing I thought was quite tenderly done, as well as it's very entertaining in parts, and there are a few laughs. It's not laboured, it's not art house or what have you. No. And there's references to getting out of Hell Island, which I thought was interesting.
If anybody would like to come in actually and ask a question or make a contribution on this subject or any of the subjects we've discussed tonight, please click raise hand, which is at the bottom of your screen, and I'll bring you in. And Paul, you've got your hand up, Paul Fleurs, but I think that's possibly a mistake. If you do want to speak, you have to allow me to make you into a panelist. So please accept that. So what I found a bit strange about some of this as well is at the beginning it shows, this strike kicks off everybody's grievances basically, and you've got the fascists coming, and you've got sort of neo-Nazis coming, and people giving speeches against foreigners and stuff. That I thought that was a bit labored, and they're dividing up the area into, that I think that reflected a little bit perhaps a lack of a political direction of the production team. What did you think?
Yeah, sorry, is this to me or to Paul?
Yeah, sorry, to you, Paul.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. I mean, then that may well, to us, it's probably. I don't think you get that huge variety of political tendencies existing in some of these areas, whereas you might get something like that happen in London or Manchester, perhaps. But I think still it sort of reflected like tensions and different ways that people can gravitate, different ways in which people can gravitate. You know, it's not, we don't all, you know, automatically become organized communists or Marxists, and we don't, you know, the process of building a party and building industrially, politically, culturally isn't something that just comes through heroic actions in formal networks, as useful as they are, you know. And our job, if you like, is to build on these struggles, to learn from them, to generalize, to locate them within a, you know, a movement for socialist transition, you know. And I think that's part of what we're doing here with the Communist Culture Club, you know, and the cultural aspect is as important in some respects as organising at work, or, you know, being involved in political education, political action, and so on.
Absolutely.
Maybe that will come in the next episode, the next series. Who knows?
Indeed, thank you. We've got a couple of people who want to speak on this. Ian?
Just a brief thing. It's about the whole notion of tendentious art, really. I mean, sometimes when you sit through a Ken Loach film and you're subjected to, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours of unmitigated gloom preached to people who already made their minds up anyway, it's just dire, really. I can't abide it. And I watched this series, and I actually enjoyed it. I really did, and I thought it was good that Sheen made it and all the rest of it. But it's always a problem, isn't it, when you're trying to get something across politically using art, that sometimes it can fail because people just switch off completely. And yet, on the other hand, it can be a sort of a real spark in a way. I mean, at the simplest level, the drama about the postmaster's travail, most of it, has really kind of stirred people up, and people could, you know, people have known for ages that these poor people were treated mercilessly by the post office, and now all of a sudden even politicians have to take notice, you know. And from that point of view, art can be brilliant in terms of giving a voice to that wasn't there. But when it gets all sort of preachy and you know, it can just sort of be tiresome, really, and no one's. That's why, in a way, I'd much prefer looking at the classics and Shakespeare, honestly, because they engage with things which go across the centuries, really. They remain fundamentally human concerns. And of course, the political context is extremely important, but it's not. But that's different from agitprop type stuff. And the funny thing is that when you look at the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks and prolet cult, for example, prolet cult started off with fairly admirable intentions of bringing culture to working people who wouldn't have otherwise had an opportunity. So sticking a cinema on a train, for example, and taking it out some remote area was a wonderful thing to do. But of course, what you end up with is the end. If it's not about, you know, men in grubby shirts toiling and, you know, and overcoming things and whatever, then it's somehow not working class art. That's the sort of thing that irritates me beyond belief, I suppose. Not that there haven't been some good stuff. I mean, you know, but it's that.
Yeah.
To just kind of sit through it, and you, oh God, and again another dreadful poem by someone, and there was a little bit of that in the series, wasn't there? Something a little bit tendentious about the whole thing, but notwithstanding it, I thought it was an excellent series.
So you're doing introduction on Ken Loach films, yeah? Ken.
I'd rather stick pins in my eyes.
Whoa, harsh. In solidarity with Ken Loach. So
There's been some great Ken Loach films.
Cass is great because it's not very it's actually not overtly political. Cass is a wonderful film. Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I think also something like Leeds United, you know, the TV stuff that Loach and Tony Garnett did was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I think the interesting that it seems, you know, coming out of this thing the way, which unfortunately I haven't seen, is actually that loss. There's a loss of experience. I mean, you go back to the miners' strike. I mean, I was in Coventry during the miners' strike. All the people I fought the miners' strike with, for a year on the street, had all been through Saltley Gate. You know, had all been, and there was that tradition, militant trade unionism. I mean, you know, the people had been on strikes. You had a cadre of shop stewards who knew what it was to lead a strike. You know, and in many cases succeeded strikes. You know, throughout the whole, you know, 20, 30 years, and you had that sort of, you know, that experience. And now, of course, you go back to the strikes we've just been through. You can see it's completely gone. It's completely gone. There isn't that experience, unfortunately, you know. And there isn't also. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that what that whole period, you know, going through from the 50s really through the 60s, 70s, 80s, is it actually nourished the left, because the left itself, in terms of its cadre and its organisations, is of course organically linked to the movement of the working class itself. I mean, however, you know, whatever political level and however imperfect and so on, we can make all these criticisms, but that exists, and the fact that there's now been, you know, these you know 20 years or a quarter of a century in which, you know, there's been barely any working class movement, you know, movement among the organised working class until very recently. You know, the occasional upsurge really has taken out, you know, any kind of political, you know, the political understanding of people. You can see that also. There's enormous confusion, enormous political confusion, because actually, I mean, all that sort of activity and the existence of political organisations actually gives some political clarity, you know, even beyond purely the membership. You know, the fact that people are constantly putting out, you know, this view of the world, you know, from the left, that penetrates. And of course, the fact that hasn't happened is enormous confusion. So, I mean, even if you sort of go and see what, I mean, you know, what the far right say, I mean, it's all over the shop. Really is crazy stuff. And when they come out with, you know, we had fascists singing about Joe Hill the other week. You know, you said, bloody hell, what the hell are you? But it's that, you know, it's that real confusion. And George Galloway spending his time cavorting with said fascists. And you can see that huge confusion that flows from that, you know, in lots of places, precisely because you haven't got tradition of the organised working class, and you haven't then therefore also got the left actually putting forward politics that penetrate into the wider working class.
Absolutely, and you know, our series is a little attempt to try and change that and start talking about culture, but also building up our culture. And we're appealing to comrades who are watching this or on video or live or afterwards, to get in touch if you would like to present something, a question, would like to talk about something, even if it's in the chat. But if you might make a presentation, a short one or a long one, please get in touch, info@ymarx.com. We'll also make an effort to get international speakers along, communists, socialists, Marxists that are active abroad, etc. I think it's really important that we build international connections with these comrades and start talking to each other, and not in a, you know, you build our own sect over there, but in an open and democratic way where we can challenge each other's ideas, as we did today with Luke and Roger. I very much enjoyed that, actually. I think that's always the best way to learn something, by having a debate. So next week we are starting our new series, ABC of Marxism, with Ian Spencer, and the week after, so they're both going to run in a 2-weekly cycle. The week after, we're getting back to the Communist Culture Club. So get in touch, please, if you have suggestions. Also, if you didn't like anything today, it would be interesting to hear criticism and what we could do better. Thank you, comrades. Good night.